suddenly I understood every word. And he was saying, there's a river of love which is flowing for you, for everybody, and it's flowing for you. And I sat there completely transfixed. Must have been 79, I suppose, summer of 79. Anyway, yeah, I just couldn't stop looking at these people, whoever they were. They had a beauty about them and a sort of composure, and they seemed to be centered, and being a dress designer, of course, I was very receptive to beauty. So the beauty of them all, young, old, men, children. So that really struck me. And I survived in my room over the baker. And then the moment came to go into the conférence at midday. And I was hauled up in the front row, being a reasonably known designer, I suppose, and also a new person. And so I had Micheline Ancier on one side of me, and there I was in the front row, and I was absolutely thinking, this is awful. I don't want to meet anybody who is responsible for these wonderful teachings, which mean so much to me. So I almost had my hand in front of my eyes like that. In fact, I think I did. I was standing like this as the master came in. And as he came in, I kind of opened my fingers and glimpsed at him. And I thought, that's all right. He's okay. He's not of the world. He's in the world and very much on the world, but there's something totally extra special. So I relaxed and I sat there and without speaking a word of French, I listened. So I sort of sat there patiently while he talked in French. And then, suddenly, he leaned across and was looking at me. And this is very emotional. I understood every word. And he was saying, there's a river of love which is flowing for you, for everybody, and it's flowing for you. And I sat there completely transfixed. And then it went back to French, and I went back to feeling uncomfortable and hot, but I think that was probably one of the most magic moments in my life. So that was my first impressions of the Bonfin. So off we went. And, oh yes, to get to the Bonfin, we then had to fill in a little form. Norman had to fill in a little form saying, because to get permission to stay there, first of all, what is your interest in the teaching? Secondly, what books have you read? And I think thirdly, how can you contribute to the teaching? So Norman looked at this and he said, I'm not interested in the teaching. I've read no books and I'm not going to contribute in any way. Signed it and we sent it off. So I thought, well, that's the answer to that one. However, it came back. The answer came back, yes, Frère Frizzell is very welcome from the master. So he said, well, I think I'll come with you. I'm curious. So he came with me to the Bonfin. However, the next day we went into a meeting, the conférence, midday, and the master listened to the conférence. I had tried to tell him how to eat in silence and so on, but that wasn't very successful with Norman, but it doesn't matter. And he said, the master, I don't know what the master said, but when Norman came out of the conférence, he was in floods of tears. And it was extraordinary. And I was sort of supporting him. He was sobbing. But it wasn't, he said, it wasn't sobbing with grief, it was sobbing with joy. He'd been talking about his visits to England and what he'd done, and occasionally, and Norman said to the master, look, if you want to come over, master, you're very welcome to come and stay with us. We had at that time a big 5-story house on the River Thames. So master said, well, thank you very much, Father, that's very kind of you. And then suddenly one day he said, Sir Frère Frizzell, how about I take you up on your offer to come to England? Saying that he would really like to come, if it was quite sure, as always with him, quite sure that there was absolutely no trouble, and he wouldn't want to cause any inconvenience, and he was the most, when it came to ordinary personal things, I've never known anybody quite so thoughtful and polite. Meanwhile, he'd been to India, and of course with Georgia, Virginia, her stories and her recounting, and his stories of India too, of how he met the Grand Babaji, and it was mind-blowing, really. And then the most extraordinary things happened to that house. Almost everything in the house suddenly went into disrepair. This was before we knew he was coming. And I thought there's a reason for this. I can't understand this. It's just weird. And this was before he'd said he'd like to come. Then he said he'd like to come. Then the builders who were having to repair the roof, which they did, they went to have lunch in the local pub one day, and there was a huge storm suddenly, only about half an hour, but enough to flood through this open roof the entire top rooms, the bedroom on the top floor, which was where the master was going to be, and the main room, which was below it, and everything, the wallpapers, the carpets, everything in those 2 rooms had to be replaced, which they were. And I was sitting inside thinking, he's not going to come. It's not possible that the master's going to come here. Master's can't come to my house. This is ridiculous. And he won't come. I mean, I'll get a message quite soon and he won't come. And I was sitting there quite sort of peacefully telling myself, no, there was no way that he was going to come. And suddenly, into the garden gate came the master with Norman and camera. And I remember opening the door and all I could say was, "Oh, Maître!" sort of gasp. Walking up the garden path. And there he was. That was really strange. I really didn't expect him to be there. But he was. How full of awe we were. Norman and I could hardly believe that night that the master was in the house. It was extraordinary. And of course then I knew why everything had to be repaired. Because everything in the place, everything was new and fresh for him. And I crept up the stairs, the 5 flights of stairs, and crept up the stairs to my normal meditation place, looking out over the river. And Norman crept into his place in the study very quietly, very sort of thinking, oh, the master's up the stairs. I mean, this is incredible for us. Settled down to meditate, and then suddenly, what should we hear? We were shaken out of our seats by loud rock music coming from the master's room. What he'd done, we just don't know. But anyway, that's what happened. So that was the end of our meditation, really. We then, I think Camera who'd said that she would, and I thought great, I was very much in agreement that she should do all the cooking. I think we did the cooking together for the first meal with the master. And what we did was to do the food as we'd seen it done at the Bonfin. Exactly. I thought that's how it was done, so that's how I should do it, with 3 courses and waiting on him and doing it as comme il faut. Anyway, the master then took a bowl, and instead of eating everything, and I had a little menu and everything as it was at the Bonfin, and waited on him. And anyway, he took a bowl, and then he put everything into the bowl at one time, and that's what he had, all together in one heap. So my little menus and my efforts at doing things at the bottom, and the camera had helped me. With that time I was showing her where everything was. And we've been shopping together and so on. However, the master then said, well, how are you, camera? And she came from the, how are you? Bonjour, camera. And the first thing he said to her was, after saying bonjour, he said, camera, I want you please to translate this book. And he handed her a huge, great, thick book and gave it to her. And she gasped and said, yes. So anyway, the whole point of that was that he didn't want her to do the cooking. He wanted her to sit and translate, and that he wanted me to do the cooking. So that was neatly settled. Without, so it was so funny. He then said that he would like to go upstairs, and he wanted the television times. He wanted to watch the television. We'd put a television in his room. he wanted to watch the television in order to learn English. He wanted asked for dictionaries and things to help him with learning English, because that was the purpose of his coming over. He was very complimentary about my cooking, and he was very, very sweet. He kept saying, "Don't speak to me while I'm eating," but in a jokey way, because meaning that with sort of lovely kind of yum yum noises, meaning that he was really enjoying it and didn't want to be interrupted. But then he was practicing his English, and that was really funny because he would come down. He'd come down and try out the phrases he'd learned on television, from the television. And he would pronounce these phrases, and he'd pronounce these sort of jokes. And they were, it was actually almost impossible to know whether they were a joke or not. But he was trying it out on us, and we didn't know whether to laugh or say how interesting or what. We sort of sit there kind of trying to guess what the reaction was that we were supposed to produce. And it was the mystery of the divine looking after the man, but at the same time knowing that this was a very small part, but it was a very important part. And this was my job, was to look after him. And Norman too, of course. But so this was an extraordinary impression, and I was always I was to rush off to do the shopping and give him everything fresh and good. But anyway, I remember one day I laid out, because I was a designer, I loved things to be beautiful, I laid out in an ebony bowl a beautiful salad of different colours in this ebony bowl, and it did look pretty. And he came down and he said, "Oh, c'est immaculément présenté, ça, immaculé." And he stood in front of it and just sort of acknowledged that it looked beautiful. And I was obviously very, very happy. And the next day, I thought, wow, this is great. Now I know how to gain the approval of the master. So I tried to do not the same, but same sort of idea, beautifully arranged and everything. He came in, he sat down at the table, and he went boom, boom, swept everything to right and left. And he didn't want me to be like that. He didn't want me to stay in that role. He wanted to show that that was just that once, and then he was going to sweep aside all these presumptions. So, right, well, okay, there we go. Lessons, lessons, lessons. It was all the time. Norman was not exactly handy in the kitchen. In fact, I think he could boil an egg, but that was about it. And he started trying to open all these oysters before the master came down. And the master actually, and he got in a terrible muddle, and he was cut himself, and he was absolutely, there was a real mess everywhere. And the master came down in the middle of it, and he said, "Oh, frère." And master that day had his beautiful blue suit on with a cravat, a tie, and he was looking very, very elegant. I think he must have been going somewhere. I don't remember where. Anyway, he came down. I said, oh frère, je vais vous montrer comment ouvrir les huîtres. And this is at my kitchen table. And so he stood there, rolled up his cuffs like this, and he stood there. He said, look, give me a glass and give me a pair of pliers. Voila. Doop, 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 doop. No mess, nothing. Oysters all opened in a flash. And he said, voilà frère. Maintenant, vous connaissez comment ouvrir les huîtres. And so they sat down and they had oysters and enjoyed them. But it was incredible, the speed and the precision. Incredible. Except that on the way to Los Angeles, I did sit next to the master. And when I did sit next to him, that was extraordinary, because he was intensely working the whole time. He was silent, and obviously, because I could tell that something was happening because his fingers were moving. And he wasn't asleep. He definitely wasn't asleep. He was the opposite of asleep. He was intensely working on something in the air. And as far as I can remember in airplanes, he was doing an intense work. And what it was, I don't know. And it would have interrupted him to ask. And but he was working absolutely non-stop in the air. He normally, he didn't talk when he was traveling much. He would be concentrating, and obviously he was carrying out a big work. And but occasionally he'd say to Norman, "Oh, how do you know how the way? How do you know how to get there? It's extraordinary, it's wonderful." And then, "N'est-ce pas?" he'd say, "Sir, isn't it wonderful?" I'd say, "Oh yes, master, it's wonderful." And Norman was a very good driver. and the master would sit beside Norman and I'd sit in the back. We lived, anyway, after about 3 days, the master came in for his meal, and he appeared to be, well, he wasn't as, something seemed not quite right. And I think Norman said, "Master, is everything all right for you?" And then he admitted, he said, "Well, look, I don't know what went on in the room that I'm in, but," he said, it's very difficult for me to get through. I don't know what went on there, and it isn't," he said, "I'm really sorry." As I wasn't going to say anything because you've gone to such trouble, but, so he said, "Oh, I'm moved, master, I'm moved." Well, just before Christmas, where do you go in Scotland? Because everything sort of shuts down. I mean, it's covered in snow, it's too cold, the hotel's shut down. So, there was no telephone in the house. So there was a telephone, we found a telephone box down the road, and Mark was with us, my son Mark. And so we got, I don't know how we did it, we got through to the operator, little Scotswoman, hello, and she helped us. She said, "Oh yes, oh you poor thing," and she she put us through free to the Kinloch Lodge Hotel, and they said yes, they'd got rooms, and so off we set. And he was very sweet and just sort of participated and was sweet. But he said, "Look, we must find somewhere to go because I need to do a work, important work, and I need to go somewhere where I can be private and where I can concentrate and, if necessary, shout. And we set off across the island of Skye, and we called in various places, post offices, and oh yes, well, Mrs. Mikhaël and Mr. Mackenzie and so on. We'll so we looked in various places, and eventually we went back and we told the master, so we found this and this and this and this and this, and we could go almost anywhere because everyone is so friendly, willing to give up their houses. And he said, well, we'll see, he said, we'll see. And we said, would you want us to go on searching? No, you've done enough, that's enough. And then one of the waiters came up to us where we were having, a young man came up to us where we were having our supper. And he said, well, I've got an aunt who's got a little place to rent, and it's quite nice, and perhaps you'd like it. And the master said, yes, we'll go. And so the next day, off we went, and to this little house. And Norman and I had a room downstairs, and there was 2 floors, and he had a nice room. Cap Camera had a tiny little room. She insisted on being next door to him. And he said, right, now, this is going to be an important work. And he said, I want you now to fast. You mustn't eat. And I want you, please, to be completely silent, absolutely silent, until midday each day. So okay. So we couldn't even use the bathroom. We could use it, but we couldn't pull the train. We couldn't have a bath. We couldn't wash. We couldn't do anything. We had to be completely silent. And this seemed to go on for a long time, and I honestly can't tell you how many days, but there were several days when we didn't eat. And then suddenly the master came downstairs, beaming all over his face, and said, I've done it. He said, I have achieved more than I thought I would. It's been very successful. He said, now you can talk and you can eat. So this was extraordinary. And then we got into the habit of we couldn't stop whispering. We couldn't get into the habit of talking again. Anyway, so that was that. That was Skye. So he said, now we can go. And we had a taxi driver who was a woman, and the master was sitting in the front seat and beside her, and he began talking to her in a way that I was just astonished, but he was talking to her in the way that would make that she would accept and listen to. But it was a language and a method of talking which I would never have used to anybody. But he was talking to her. He knew how to make her listen and accept something that he was saying. So we drove up to Hyde Park, and we took a picnic. And we sat on a bench in Hyde Park. It was not summer, it was quite chilly. And so we all sat in a row on the bench, and he spent his time feeding his picnic. Again, he was completely concentrated, and he was there to do a work. It wasn't to chat to us, it wasn't to anything else, it was for his work. So we sat there more or less in silence, and he which we often did with him, it was often in silence, and was feeding pigeons, except he said, oh, quelle personnalité of the pigeons. I think all his sandwiches went to pigeons. Anyway, then he said, well, now I would like to buy a winter coat. So we walked up Knightsbridge, busy Knightsbridge, and he was very insistent that I should be very close to him. And once I was slightly apart, and he's pulled me over, touched me on the arm, and made it known that he wanted me to be very close to him. I was on his right-hand side. And so we walked up, we went into one shop, which was then the Scotch House for a coat, asked a lady there, who was absolutely enchanted with him. She was so sweet, little Scottish lady. Oh, what a gentleman, such a gentleman. And well, after a few months, again, the exact date I can't remember, but he said, now is the time for me to give a talk in London, a public talk. So Norman arranged for I said, for how many people? He said, I want everybody to come. This is public. And you can all ask your friends and neighbours and everybody. You could all, and I want it to be a big place. So Norman organised for this big lecture hall in Caxton Hall, which, funnily enough, was a place where, for instance, Aleister Crowley and Rosicrucians and all sorts of extraordinary people held their rituals. So anyway, we all got our friends and relations and absolutely everybody we think of to come to this talk. And the master came in, and we were sitting in the front row as sort of beaming whatever good thoughts we could to him, because his English was amazingly good, considering he'd only been studying for a very short time. But it was a big thing for him. It was a huge thing, and the place was full. And anyway, he gave his talk, as he always did, saying, that he hoped that they would forgive him for talking using the beautiful language. He always said this, it was such a beautiful, rich language, but he hoped that everybody would forgive him for not speaking as fluently as he would like to. And he gave a talk, as he always did, about the basics of eating and living. And another time he wanted to give a talk in Richmond. After this, which he did, we found there's a little hotel just up the road. We hired this room in this little hotel just up the road, and that was much smaller. And but that was pretty full. A lot of people came, including a very lovely little lady from the Caribbean, from St. Lucia, called Pearl, who was a contact of a great friend of mine who was a clairvoyant called John Christopher Travers, and he was a very great friend of mine. And he said, look, I've talked to this Pearl, who is very clairvoyant, and I suggested she come to this talk. And so Pearl, round and beautifully shiny and black, and came very diffidently and cautiously, and she sat there and turned out to be of tremendous help spreading the teaching. She had her own television show later in New York and read out the teaching every day, and it was a phone-in program in which she talked about the teaching, read out the talk for the day every day. And then later I took her to the Bonfin, and Master came down one morning, and this was after Christmas, and said, Frere, Norman, how would you like to go to Egypt? So Norman said, ooh, well, I'd love to, thank you. And then there was a sort of pause, whereas myself and camera kind of held our breath. So the master said to Norman, well, shall we invite the sisters to come too? Oh, yes, master, said Norman. And so he said, okay. So he said, right. And he came down with Norman with a map. And he wanted to go there for his birthday. So obviously he needed to be in a certain place at a certain time for his birthday to do some magic work. And he came down with this map and he said, well, now, first of all, we'll have to go to Cairo, I think he said. But he said, well, what I want to do is to get on a boat that travels up the coast of the Red Sea, and I want this boat to be at a certain place, and he pointed on his map, which was somewhere on the coast, and at a certain date. We flew to Cairo, and as we went to Cairo, Norman and I went through the immigration thing, and they held the master back. So we were standing on one side, and master was standing on the other side, looking very sort of, I was kind of looking at him and kind of dancing about, and he was kind of smiling at me as if to say, this is all a joke, don't worry about it. and they let him through eventually, thank goodness. And off we all went to stay in a hotel. And we went into these shipping agents, and we absolutely looked at us at absolute horror. We said we want to go to this place called Kasir. They looked at us in horror, said, why on earth should you want to go there? You must be mad. So anyway, we had to go back in the evening and say, we're very sorry, master, but we've completely failed. We can't find anybody. So he said, okay, well, let's see what we can do. So he said, I know what we'll do. We'll go down to Luxor. We'll fly to Luxor, and we'll look from there, see what we can find there. So we got another flight to Luxor. And we got on a boat with about 3 or 4 of these workers. I think it was EDF, yes, it was EDF, with the master. And there was a young man who was a guide, and the young man was standing in the bows, sort of holding on to the bows, the front of the boat, holding on to the mast, standing. And we were sitting at the back of the boat. And the master started talking in a very loud voice. And I've got it written down, and I have to remember what he was talking about. But it was very, he was talking very loudly and very insistently. And he even had his hand on the shoulder of one woman there and was sort of gently shaking her. And these French people were very shocked. And we were sitting there kind of gasping. But the young man in the front of the boat, who was holding on to the mast, said, yes, he's right, he's absolutely right, you must listen to him. And very sort of fervently. And then we landed on this island. It was absolutely extraordinary, and we all got off, and Norman and I were quite, and camera, we were quite shaken. And the master said, well, you couldn't see it, but I could. But there were evil spirits over that boat, and I had to dispel them. So that was quite extraordinary, and then the master said, right, he was going to go off to do his work, and he was going to go into the dunes, these big high dunes, very steep, and would we please join him at midday. So we kind of stayed around, wrote notes, and he went off into the desert. And we kept looking at the dunes, and we didn't see him. We didn't know where he went exactly. And eventually he came back and he said, well, you didn't see me waving. Well, we didn't, and we were looking. And then we had the same palaver with lunch. And then he went to his room to meditate. And then the same thing happened the next day. I think he and Norman went down to the Red Sea and sat on the shores of the Red Sea for a bit. He then went off into the mountains, into the dunes, and this time we were absolutely had our eyes skinned. The following day Norman and I did see the master, and we did go and join him, but climbing up these very steep dunes, they were high, and about the height of a 5-story building, really, or more. They were high. But my goodness, it was hard to get up them. Anyway, there was the master on the top. And he said, well, now we'll go back for lunch, right? He then raced off down the dune. I've never seen anything like it. Norman and I were slipping and sliding like and he was, with his cane in his hand, was running down the dune as if there wasn't a slope of any sort. And that was that. We did that the following day. And then eventually the master said he'd done his work. So we were, and we'd arranged that the taxi driver would come, which he did. And thankfully I was thankful. Norman thought it was all wonderful. Then the master said, right, I don't want to stay in this hotel anymore. I want you and Norman, please, to go and search for a hotel which is inexpensive. And then we found one which was very new. And we walked in, and yes, they had rooms, and it was very new. It had obviously just been built. So, yes, we could go. So we went back and told the master, and we went back with the master. And there was a young man behind the counter on the reception, very young. He looked very, very bright. And this young man said to us, "You have no idea who that is. This man has come to save the world." Just like that. So it was extraordinary. And I have to quickly add that in the hotel that we'd been in, I think it was called the Winter Palace, there was an elevator, a lift, and on every floor, every elevator had somebody at the doors to open them and shut them for you. And on every floor, as the master went past, they were staring in at him. It was as if they really recognized who he was. I don't know, but anyway. So anyway, that's what that young man said. When we got back, he did what he normally does, which is to say, I would like something to eat. So we got in at the door, immediately rushed about trying to find things to eat. And then we sat down and he looked at me and he laughed. He said, "Enfin, c'est propre." He looked at me and he said, "Sir Cherry, if only you could have seen your face wherever we went." So he was really amused. I remember going out one day and just walking in his garden, and he was there feeding his doves and talking to them. And I felt, and it was such a sort of communion he had with the doves, that I felt rather, I kind of hid behind a tree really, because it was, seemed like intruding. But he didn't reply or talk. He just, my impression was he simply didn't waste words. I mean, he was involved himself in a big interior work or exterior work, however you like to put it, all the time. But again, that was my impression. I may be wrong, but certainly with us. And a lot of the time he was with us. He would be silent. Sometimes, it's true, he gave a talk on matters which were profound, but quite often he was with us in silence. Food, but he himself would eat almost nothing, and he was very, very frugal with his eating. But I must say, again in Luxor, we went out into the market and we bought, there was a store we'd been told about that made falafel, which was these little chickpea cakes. And we said to ourselves, I wonder if the master might like these. So off we went into the market, and we bought falafel and we delivered it to his room. I don't know whether he did eat them or not. I have no idea, but that was so eating. And his coffee he did have. He did have his tea, which he asked me to do always, and he ate very little when he was out that we knew of. And remember one night, I had a bedroom which had a wall and a window which was facing onto the master's chalet itself. And there was a short gap. I imagine it would be about just a few yards, really, between his chalet and ours. And my bed was along the wall. And I remember suddenly waking up in the middle of the night, and it was extraordinary. There was some huge force. It was as if I was enormous wind or something, kind of trying to blow me out of bed, to the extent that I was kind of clinging onto the mattress to stay in bed and hanging on to it. And it was absolutely extraordinary. And I was thinking, what on earth is going on? And there I sort of stayed for a bit, kind of clinging on for dear life. And then I went back to sleep again. But anyway, in the next day, the master came to see us. And I said, Master, it was very odd, this happening in the middle of the night. And he said, oh, yes, what time was it? I sorry, I didn't know I didn't stop to look at a clock. He said, I must have been doing something, he said. Je suis en train de faire quelque chose. So, it was extraordinary. Yes, it was wonderful. I mean, I was so impressed with Laval, with the devotion of the brothers and sisters there, the way it all worked. We were absolutely bowled over by it. The fact that every single person there, as far as I could see, had their own dwelling place. They might share, but they all had their own dwelling place. They didn't share, they didn't live in a community. It was a collectivity, as the master kept stressing, it is too early to live in a community. We must live in a collectivity. In fact, at one point at the Bonfin, he talked to us about how the ideal of a Brotherhood Centre should be that every brother and sister should have their own front door, which wasn't necessarily overlooked by anybody else. And we were really delighted with the setup at Laval and how it all worked, and the devotion of the Canadian brothers and sisters and the way they accepted to live like this. And in front of us, the whole Canadian choir. And so they began to sing. And it was the first time that they sang Mille Colombes. And it was extraordinary. This beautiful music and the force of it being directed in a reasonably small space to a very small group. It just completely bowled me over. And brothers and sisters, of course, will know Mille Colombes. And it was the first time I'd heard it, and I was just completely taken over by that. Music affects me very much. And I turned aside and I looked at the master, and the master looked at me. And I swear at that moment that was the conception of the idea of forming a Brotherhood Centre ourselves, because he knew that and saw that we were, well, I was, I'm sure Norman was too, very inspired by the example of the centre at Laval. So after this concert, I went out with Norman, and I said, Norman, we need to form a centre in England, and if possible, like the centre at Laval. And so I think that I can honestly say I think that was the conception of the centre of the Dove's Nest. Yes, I must say that my time with the Canadian brothers and sisters was something very special and enchanting, and it was easy to work with them, it was easy to be with them. They were funny and they were happy, and it was lovely. And so Yasna showed us her paintings, which were very lovely. I was very impressed with them, and it was a wonderful time on which we hope to build the Brotherhood Centres in England and haven't yet succeeded. And then eventually, through a long series of circumstances, found a transcription of a talk of the master lying on a mantelpiece. And I picked it up idly, was waiting for an appointment, and that was everything I needed to know in it. It was about the sun, and it was by the master. So I obviously asked what it was, got a book, which was The Splendour of Tiferet, in English, because I didn't speak French then, and read that book until it fell to pieces. I read it on the underground going to work. I read it everywhere, and that for me was incredible. I then eventually, when the book fell to pieces, I got another book. I think it was The Mysteries of Yesod, and it was everything I needed to know. Well, the person